Here we are moving forward into one more section. And this is when we talk about the classification issue of short term debt that is expected to be refinanced. So, what happens in this case is that as of the balance sheet date, you have some short term debt. And this has, you have the intent and the ability to show that you will be refinancing this not on a short term basis, on a long term basis. So it's going to mature within the next year. You are working on refinancing it so that way it can be uh, paid in 3, 6, 9 years, whatever the case may be. This particular short term debt actually is not going to consume the working capital, the current assets of the organization in order to retire it. Once upon a time, there was only an intention that was tied to this that you had to meet in order to exclude it from current status and have it in long term status. However, that has been tightened up a little bit. A lot of this has happened as the result of some lending things that have changed over the years. We all saw how lending really tightened up following 2008. Your book talks about Penn Central Railroad, who had constant 90-day notes that were just renewing every 90 days. And then what happens is that potentially your lender decides that they're not going to renew it. There is no obligation for them to continue to renew it. So you have to meet some specific requirements in order to actually exclude it. And the first is, of course, you need to have that intent to refinance that obligation for a long term basis. Long term basis, of course, being something greater than the operating cycle or a year, whichever is longer. You then also must be able to demonstrate that you have the ability to refinance it. Now, this can occur in a couple of ways. Between the point in which the balance sheet date is, so say December 31st, 2017, and its actual issuance, there is a time lag in there. You can finish up your financing and actually have that financing occur in that time lag period, or you can enter into a formal financing agreement with the institution to evidence that you will have that refinanced into a long term debt and that there are terms that are easily, readily available and determinable. Many companies just constantly do take care of this. They will take their regular debt and they refinance it and they flip it into longer. This is a normal part of the leverage and capital structure of a corporation. This particular slide, which is available in the slides on your Canvas, is not actually in your book. So you'll want to perhaps print this and have it as an additional resource. Just this slide, you don't have to print the entire PowerPoint. The one thing I would actually like to point out to you is if you go to page 672 of the book, it talks about the international perspective and how the IFRS is actually a little bit tighter on this than we are here in the US. Keep in mind for those of you that are in ACC 312, you always want to read these international perspectives. And at the end of the chapters, when they talk about the differences between IFRS and GAAP, you're going to want to pay some attention to that because that is applicable to you. So as you can see here in this flow chart, we have some short terms that we expect to refinance. First, do we intend to? No, we're not going to refinance it. We're just going to retire it. Well, then you're going to classify that as a current liability. Yes, we intend to refinance, but do we have the ability to demonstrate um, the ability to refinance that? Not at this time. We would classify it as a current liability. Now, maybe we do have that ability. We do it by actually refinancing after the balance sheet date, but before the actual issuance date, or entering into a financing agreement that is non cancelable with a capable lender. If either of those situations occur, then we can exclude that from our current liabilities and then reclassify them as long term debt. Just to kind of give you a little bit of an example, let's look at Alexander Company here. Alexander Company, they have $1.2 million of short term debt in the forms of notes payables that are due February 2nd, 2018, as of the balance sheet date of December 31st, 2017. On January 21st, 2018, the company issues 25,000 shares of their common stock for $36 per share, receiving 900,000 proceeds after a variety of brokerage fees and other costs related to the issuance. On February 2nd, 2018, the proceeds from that stock sale, supplemented by an additional $300,000 worth of cash, are used to liquidate that $1.2 million of debt. The December 31st, 2000 balance sheet is going to be issued on February 23rd, 2018. So the question is, uh, we need to show how the 1.2 million of short-term debt should be presented as of the December 31st, 2017 balance sheet. So we have a liability of 1.2 million that we're trying to determine how to classify. On January 21st, 2018, we issued stock for 900,000, uh, and we paid off our liability of 1.2 million on February 2nd. Here's our basic timeline. We would recognize $300,000 worth of current liabilities and notes payable. This is what we used of working capital in order to liquidate that debt. If you will recall and think back to the prior slide, it says that we took the 900,000 from the issuance of the 25,000 shares, and we supplemented it by $300,000 in cash. Cash being a current asset, we would want to recognize the equivalent amount as a current liability. Now, we would have long term debt we would show as of December 31st, 2017, of notes payables that were refinanced of 900,000. They were refinanced not necessarily through an additional debt issue, but they were refinanced through an equity issue. This represents the full $1.2 million of liabilities that were in question of classification for the December 31st, 2017 balance sheet. We have several of these that come through in the course of any PowerPoint or in your book. I know how absolutely tempting it is to kind of blow by them and be like, oh, this doesn't mean anything. They do. They help you apply information and talk about where things have gone wrong. So I want you, as you encounter these, what do the numbers mean in your text or in the PowerPoints, to take the time to go ahead and read them and just process the information they give to you. So in this example, it's actually talking about how the GE, Apple, UPS, they had a lot of short-term debt that they were just refinancing over and over. And they were looked at by the analysts and they were criticized, which affected their stock prices, um, for just continuing to do this, to take care of using these maturities that were shorter term. Uh, this impact on the stock price, while initially you can say is not a huge impact to maybe the organizations, does have some impact to it in that they cannot issue new stock at the same amount that they could prior. So, because of this, these different organizations have realized that they need to be a little bit more aware and lock in those lower interest rates whenever they can. And that is what this variety of organizations did. Now, the next one that we'll go into. The next set of lectures will actually be looking at gains and loss contingencies. So please feel free to take a break before you go into gains and loss contingencies because we've really talked about a lot of information from the beginning to here. Uh, when again, I've pointed out areas that I will dig down into on Monday when we come into meeting. This is going to happen the same with gains and loss contingencies. So be prepared to take notes. Send me those questions ahead of time. Remember, we meet on Mondays. Really love to have those questions by Friday because if I don't have them, I may not be able to bring additional resources to you. And I love to be able to provide you with those as quickly as possible. These particular topics that we are going to be dealing with in this section of the class are not going to be as buildable, and you're going to be quizzing and you are going to be doing homework and exams on these more frequently than you were underneath the other format. So I will see you in the next lecture. Have a great evening.